Hello, I'm Dr. Gloria Horsley.
And I'm her daughter, Dr. Heidi Horsley.
Heidi and I want to welcome you to Open to Hope Conversations, the podcast.
We believe that the greatest gift you can give yourself after a loss is hope, using this moment to connect with others who have not only survived but thrived.
So let's get started. Welcome to the Open to Hope Show. I'm your host, Dr. Gloria Horsley, and I'm here with my daughter and co-host,
Dr. Heidi Horsley.
Well, Heidi, we have got two great guests on today and a very interesting show because we're going to be talking about when you are born after the death of a sibling. It could be a miscarriage or, a stillbirth or whatever, that you are born after that child has died.
So you're technically a bereaved sibling, even if you didn't know your sibling. And I
Mhm.
always say, your parents parent you differently when they've had a loss, and that you're the one that comes after that. It was interesting because my father was born after the death of his brother, he died at birth, and he didn't even realize that he was a bereaved sibling. And we did a show, I don't know, we were talking about it one day, and he looked at us and went, wait a minute, I am a replacement child and I am a bereaved sibling. And I didn't realize it. And maybe that's why my mom was a little distant and had a hard time connecting with me. So anyway, we'll talk more with our guests about this, but I think that's fascinating.
It's really an interesting topic and one that doesn't get talked about or approached at all.
Absolutely
So
not.
really fascinating. So how do you want to introduce our
Yes.
guests?
So we've had both of them on before. Sarah Vollmann was on recently on our cable show. And like I said, we're going to be talking with both guests, Dr. Joann O'Leary and Sarah Vollmann, about born after the death of a sibling. Let me introduce Sarah first. Sarah is a registered board-certified art therapist and a clinical social worker. She is a faculty member of the Portland Institute for Loss and Transition. She is an associate director of the Young Widowhood Project and the author of the book with Dr. Joann O'Leary, which is Born into Loss, Shadows of a Deceased Sibling and Family Journeys of Grief.
It's such a great book because they did over 100 interviews, I believe, of people who have been born after the death of a sibling.
That's amazing. Welcome, Sarah.
Thank you so much for having me.
Good to have you back. And with you is your partner in crime here, Dr. Joann O'Leary. I love that you all did this book together. Joann has worked individually with families and facilitated weekly pregnancy after loss groups for over 35 years. In 2016, she was a Fulbright specialist at University College Cork and is a consultant to Star Legacy Foundation. Joann has written several books, including Pregnancy and Parenting After Loss, Different Baby, Different Story, and the book that she and Sarah wrote together, Born into Loss, Shadows of a Deceased Sibling and Family Journeys of Grief. Welcome, Dr. Joann.
Thank you so much for having us.
I wondered how you guys got interested in this topic.
Well, for me, it's been, first of all, I myself was born after the death of a sister. So it's something, if I look back in my journey to become someone who became a therapist who specializes in working with grief and loss, I know it's all very connected to that start for me with what happened in my family and the grief that was in my family. So this is something that I'm deeply connected to, but as you guys mentioned earlier, it's something that is rarely talked about. There's very little literature about it.
Yeah, I wondered before we get to Joann, how she got involved. I wanted to ask you, how did your sibling die, and how was that approached by your family that you knew, even knew? I think some
Sure. Do
people.
you want me to talk about that now?
Sure.
Yeah. My family was living in New Hampshire, and my sister died. She was 6 years old. She was almost 7, and she drowned one day in August when they were at a lake just swimming. So it was just a obviously very sudden, very unexpected, horrific event for my family. And my family was devastated. So I have a brother who was older, who was 9 at the time. My sister was 6 when she died. And then my other sister was an infant. And I obviously wasn't born yet. So the whole family was just completely heartbroken and devastated. And I was born like 2 years later. But what my parents shared with me when I was an adult, actually. They kind of laughed and they said, you were actually the only child who was planned. They said, you're like, I guess the other ones, my mom got pregnant easily, they all came. But after my sister died, my family actually, they sold their house. They moved to Italy on a sabbatical with my dad. And they didn't really have the money to do this. I think they cashed in all their savings, sold the house. But I think they were just so desperate to have a change of scenery and to try to kind of survive as a family that they did this. And they said, and my dad, was a professor and he was writing a book while on a sabbatical, and he just kind of plunged himself into work to survive this loss. But supposedly late at night one night, he was up super late just writing on the book, couldn't sleep. And my mom came downstairs and said, I want another baby. And that was me. And so I was the only planned baby, but, planned after this loss and in the midst of this grief.
Well, Sarah, did your family talk about your sister growing up, or was it just not discussed?
They did talk about my sister, which obviously I think is a good thing. I wouldn't have wanted it to be a secret. What was tricky was that my sister was often referred to as being perfect. My mom, even after reading the research article that I wrote about this, still talked about my sister as being perfect. And what she used to say was, I know a lot of parents, if they lose a child, say that the child was perfect, but I need you to know that your sister actually really was perfect. And, even her kindergarten teacher said she was perfect. So that was kind of the proof, right, that my sister was actually a perfect human being. So, my parents were wonderful parents. They did their best. And it was also very difficult for me and my siblings to grow up hearing about this perfect sibling.
I got into this. I had already been researching parents who were pregnant after a loss, but the first pregnancy after loss group that I ever did, when they left, the clinical nurse specialist that was working with me, Linda Parker, turned to me and said, oh my God, did you see all those mothers with high-risk pregnancies? Because they were afraid to even think there was a baby inside and worried about preterm labor. Some of the babies had died from that. And I said, did you see all those babies with attachment disorders? Because I visualized these little ones in there saying, oh my God, I'm here, I'm here, I'm here. So that's kind of how we got into it, and why I'm just passionate about families pregnant after a loss, understanding the baby's already here. The baby already can feel, plus the research supports that now from stress during pregnancy. And then, of course, I also saw the siblings, because I was initially a preschool special ed teacher. So the siblings alive at the time, like Sarah's brother, were really impacted by the loss too. So it's not just the child that follows.
Right.
It's the whole family. It's a ripple effect.
There can be the fantasy, and a lot of what Joann's written about that I think is so important is talking about how if somebody loses a baby in pregnancy, how that impacts so much their future pregnancy experience. So how fearful they'll be during another pregnancy, how they'll be maybe fearful to attach to the baby when they're pregnant, or even fearful right after the baby's born because they're like, well, I know I had one that died already and this one could die too.
Yeah, overprotective parenting for sure. And in the past, they didn't have ultrasounds. At least parents now have ultrasound pictures that they can have in memory of their deceased baby.
So many people are protected by their parent, overprotected, and people saying, I couldn't ride a bike, I couldn't swim, I couldn't do this and that because my parents just thought I'd be killed. So they grew up in this very protective, overprotective parenting.
How do we deal with this? If I have had a child that died and now I'm concerned, I want to have another baby.
We have so much to say about this, don't we, Joann? But I think there's a lot. I mean, one of the big reasons for this book was really that I think there can be a lot of education and prevention that's done, because I think it's really off of people's radars. And I'll say something that some people may say is a little controversial. Like now, I don't know if you have both heard this term, but a lot of people are using the term rainbow baby for babies who were born after a baby after loss. And I mean, we all love rainbows. We all love babies. The term rainbow baby sounds very appealing and kind of cute and sweet. But when you think about the term rainbow baby, from my perspective, it's problematic because it's really giving that baby born after that their identity is then part of being born after the death of somebody else versus letting them just be their own, they're a baby. They're their own baby, right? So, I think that there can be some education about that if you don't see the baby as kind of your consolation prize or the baby that came after loss, but you see it as this own unique baby, and you can mourn your loss, which you need to, of the baby that died or the child that died, and then also have this other baby and try to separate them a little bit. I think that if people can be more aware about that, that could be hugely helpful. And I know, Joann, you have a lot to add about this too, I'm sure.
Yeah, I don't like the term rainbow baby either because doing pregnancy after loss groups for over 35 years, some of those second pregnancies die too. Those babies die too. So what does that say? So that's why we've developed a model of intervention during pregnancy so that parents know they are still parents to their deceased baby and can embrace this new baby to help separate them. One deceased baby is there still love and they can love this new baby too. So it's all about the continued bond and attachment to both babies. They're still attached to the baby that died, and people don't understand that. They think, oh, they're pregnant again, they're going to not be sad anymore. And what happens is it's a whole new layer of grief because, like Sarah said, they're afraid that baby's going to die too. So it's a lot of work to help them through the next pregnancy.
I think even the
And
term replacement child,
yes.
very negative term, like you said, they're individual people. I'm wondering, for both of you, have you seen a lot of, I would think there would be a lot of pressure, and maybe it's just internal pressure with the child that lives after a baby has died. I mean, Sarah, I know you were that child. Is there a lot of pressure for them in a lot of ways to be perfect or to fill the void that is left by the child that died?
Often, yes. And so, Heidi, you brought up the term that also we need to talk about that again is another term that people have very mixed feelings about. But the first research that was done about people born after the death of a sibling, we were labeled as being replacement children. Something that I kind of came to and wrote about a little was I think it's better to look at it as replacement dynamics versus thinking about if somebody is a replacement child or isn't a replacement child, because sometimes maybe one parent really looks at them in some ways with these replacement fantasies, whereas the other doesn't. Like, how do you decide if someone is or isn't? And it also changes over time with a family, right? So it's a fluid thing. It's not an either or necessarily, but many times, yes, kids are born afterwards and the parents are hoping that maybe having another child will make them feel less sad, will take care of some of their grief, will fill this void, which again, is understandable, but that's a lot of weight to put on another human being coming into the picture. And as we all know, children are very sensitive and attuned to their parents, all these unspoken messages about, their parents grieving and, that they're kind of there to make things better. They pick up on this, they soak it up, right? So then they do take on this role of trying to kind of make things better in their family. And that's a heavy weight. And then sometimes people feel a harder time kind of having their own identity because this other identity is imposed on them in spoken and then unspoken ways. We saw some people who we have one chapter we wrote about gender, for example, which is very interesting because sometimes people have another baby and they really hope that the baby born after will be the same gender as the one who died. And for example, we had a few girls, and again, I'm speaking in terms of, gender stereotypes here, which I don't, endorse, but just these were the terms that were used by the people that we spoke to. But for example, a few girls who were born after the death of a boy and said, I became this like really sporty kind of tomboy child. And I know my dad really wanted a son that he could coach in Little League, et cetera. And, in retrospect, I think maybe I wouldn't have done all those things if it hadn't been for the loss of my brother, but I felt like I had to be there for my dad in those ways because that's what he wanted. So again, thinking about how somebody's identity is kind of altered by this experience if there's these hopes that are put on them.
Yeah, and I don't think a lot of parents, anyway, that I interviewed, felt like they put pressure on the other child, but sometimes that child did, just because I lived. I feel like I have to be the best in everything. I feel like I have to go to college. I feel like I have to perform well because my brother didn't live. So
It's interesting for me sitting here because I just had kind of an aha moment. And Sarah, you'll be interested to hear what I'm saying because you know my background. I
Mhm.
had miscarriages and then I adopted my daughter. Now, I don't consider her a rainbow child or a replacement child. She knows I had 2 miscarriages. So I'm wondering how she sees this whole thing. You know what I mean? Like, does she see pressure? I don't know. We've never even had this conversation because I never even thought about it until this podcast.
Mhm.
That's so fascinating, Heidi. I think there's so many things that, like, again, these types of losses that we don't necessarily connect the dots with and think about. In the book, Heidi and I share the fact that we're both adoptive moms. And in the book, I actually wrote a little snippet about my experience being an adoptive mom. And I actually, ever since I was little, I wanted to adopt, and I knew instead of, I didn't adopt because of infertility. I adopted because that was something I kind of, ever since I was a little child, thought I wanted to do. And it wasn't really until later, you know, relatively recently that I kind of connected some dots. And I thought, isn't this fascinating that, I was a replacement in some ways for the sister who died. And then as an adoptive mom, I was taking on this role with this child who lost his birth mother and then lost his foster mother, and who was grieving when he came to me. And I felt like I could never be good enough and measure up to these 2 mothers that he was missing, right? And I thought, so I've kind of recreated my situation, that I was born into this family after the sister who died and felt like I could never be good enough. And then I was in the situation with this child who was torn away from his foster family at 10 months, who loved his foster mother and was grieving, very visibly grieving when I got him. And I was trying to get him to attach to me, and it was very difficult. So again, it was kind of this repetition. I thought, what did I do unconsciously to recreate this in my life? And then I had a friend who's a therapist who said to me, well, maybe another reason you were drawn to adoption was that you knew you could understand a grieving child because you were a child born into grief, just like a child who's adopted in some ways is born into grief. But it's just interesting how all the pieces connect, isn't it?
It is. Yeah, truly.
So what would you recommend, both of you, to Joanne, we'll start with you, to parents that have had now another child? I mean, what are like the do's and don'ts?
Yeah, well, we have developed a prenatal attachment model of intervention to use at each stage in pregnancy to help them move forward. And it takes, for instance, when I do the pregnancy after loss group, the end of each session, I say goodnight to the unborn babies, and they're like, and I start with the youngest and then go to the oldest. And one mom said, well, I'm not going to tell you how many weeks pregnant I am. But when she found out what I was doing, she said, okay, I'll say I'm 18 weeks. So one of the moms said, I didn't want to hear it. She said, in the first trimester, I didn't want to know there was a baby inside, but I always say the baby's part of the group. The baby already knows the story. And so it's really helping them say it's okay to tell this baby your fears and anxieties because they already know it, and to talk about the deceased baby. And sometimes I think the sibling that died brings them along, you know?
Mhm.
I don't.
I love that. I like that. Yeah. Kind of normalize the situation for them.
It is
Normalize
normal. Yeah, it's
how
normal
you're
grief.
feeling,
And
normalize, the process. I love this peer support too. I mean, if people can get into a group where there are other pregnant women who have the same kind of fears. Unfortunately, I don't think we're educated enough in this country to, pick up this model or whatever. It's such a new idea to normalize it. So I'm hoping all your information is getting out to other hospitals and other places to do these kind of groups.
right, because we also have a parenting after loss group, because they need to be with other people like that understand this is why I'm anxious and what are you guys doing to not be so anxious. And it's it's amazing, the peer support, because like Sarah said, it doesn't end. It takes a long time to trust that that baby's going to be here and stay. So,
Mhm. I, we
Yeah.
did, probably it would be a long conversation, but did you get involved at all with husbands, also husbands and wives working together on this?
yes, absolutely. Dr. Mark Murphy at University College Cork has done research with them as couples together, which has been really interesting. And I have separate research. I interviewed fathers separately from the moms, and we always had fathers in our group too. But Margaret got some really interesting data of interviewing them together of things that the moms didn't understand that they needed, the husband needed, or the partner needed. So,
What does the husband need?
well, for one thing, they didn't want to get pregnant right away because they needed time to grieve that they were fathers to their deceased baby. So, and they need lots of support too. Parents or doctors don't necessarily even ask the parent, the father or partner, how are you feeling? So, um, talking to them directly, what's
Mhm.
going on with you?
Mhm.
They're just as scared.
Right. Hmm. Yeah, a lot of issues. Well, tell us about your websites, where people can get your book, how they can, if they want to connect up more with this, how can they do it?
Yeah, there's a lot of resources. So our book is available pretty much everywhere. It's on Amazon, anywhere you can order books, you can find it. I also want to give a little shout out to an organization I'm on the board for, which is called the Replacement Child Forum, which is a resource online people can find, which has information. Both for professionals working with people who were born after the loss of a sibling and for people who are themselves born after the death of a sibling. Joann, what do you have to add?
Well, I do groups for Star Legacy Foundation, so and they're all on Zoom. They also have a special group just for fathers. And I have a group for which I just love, it's the grandparent group, besides the parenting after loss, because the grandparents are grieving not only the loss of their grandchild, but their adult child that they didn't know beforehand. And it's been really just as many grandfathers come on as grandmothers.
Mhm.
So yeah, there is a lot available through Star Legacy Foundation.
Absolutely fabulous. Well, thank you both for being on and all your research, and such an interesting and important topic.
Yes, I love this. I love that you're building awareness for it and that you're acknowledging that these siblings are bereaved siblings. Sarah is a bereaved sibling, as am I. My brother lived to 17 and I knew him, but your sister you knew in different ways through story and through the void that she left in the family. So I love that you're bringing this to awareness because I think there's a lot of siblings out there that are not getting support and that don't really even recognize the fact that they're bereaved siblings.
Mhm.
So
Right. And
Yes,
I
it's
also
true.
want to do a shout in for the chapter on children who were the next child born after a sibling with special needs, because they don't talk, those siblings aren't talked about either. And it's pretty amazing how they parallel a lot of the children that who didn't know their sibling. Yeah, it's pretty amazing. They all, in my research, all of the adults, including Sarah, they are sensitive, caring people. And that's what I keep telling these parents pregnant after a loss. It's okay to understand your unborn baby is feeling grief. You need to give them the words for why you're feeling sad. It's not because you don't want them, it's because you want them so much.
I mean, I think it's the fundamental issue that grieving, just bigger picture that grieving families struggle, which is how do you hold a loss in a family?
Mhm.
And how painful that is and how each family member is going to do it in their own way. But hoping what we've seen is, when it's kept as a secret, that's obviously not healthy. It's also not healthy when, the lost child is so central and maybe idealized. So trying to kind of hold the loss, and every family is going to be different in how they can do that, but trying to hold the loss in a way that allows people to be themselves, to still be invested in the present of the family, while also grieving that person as a family.
Well, we want to thank you both for being on the show today. It's been terrific, and I love the resources that you've given people with your book and also with the things that you're doing. And thank you so much.
Thank
Oh,
you so
thank
much
you.
for having us.
Yes, thank you for having us. Very special.
Thank you. That was a great show. Thank you for helping so many people find hope after loss.
And Heidi and I want to thank everybody for joining us on this show today. And we always want to remind you that if you've lost hope, please lean on ours until you find your own, and God bless.
I'm Dr. Heidi Horsley. You have been listening to Open to Hope, the podcast. You can follow Open to Hope on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. To learn more, visit us at opentohope.com and go to Apple Podcasts to subscribe.
I'm Dr. Gloria Horsley. Join us again next week for another Open to Hope conversation, where we invite you to lean on our hope until you find your own.